It was an ordinary night for me, or rather, it was supposed to be ordinary. I worked as a security guard at a small city hospital, and usually the night shifts were pretty quiet. The hospital was almost empty. Only a few nurses and doctors worked in the emergency room, while the rest of the staff went home. The corridors were quiet, almost eerily quiet. I usually liked that silence, but that night, things were different. It was exactly 23:45 p.m. I was sitting in the security office watching the cameras. There was nothing ordinary on the screens, empty corridors, closed doors, and a few nurses occasionally passing by. I was sipping my coffee, thinking about how I was going to end the night. But my eyes suddenly caught the camera in the lower left corner. At first, I couldn't make out what I was seeing. A shadow. Something that moved quickly, then disappeared in an instant. I quickly moved a little closer to the monitors. I rewound the image, but I couldn't find the shadow again. Maybe I'm tired, I thought to myself. Night shifts can sometimes play tricks on your mind, making you think you're dreaming. But I had a strange feeling inside me. I thought I had to check. I took my flashlight and went out into the hallway. There was no sound in the hallway except my footsteps. The silence affected me a little more than usual. Maybe it was because of that thing I thought I saw that I felt this way. I walked around for a while, but there was nothing. "You're talking nonsense," I said to myself. I turned back and started walking towards the office. But at that moment I heard a voice. A very faint whisper. I stopped and listened. The voice seemed to be coming from somewhere far away, but it was impossible to understand what it was saying. I took a few steps and started walking in the direction of the voice. At the end of the hallway was an area that was almost unused. This was an old area, not used much anymore. The lights were usually off here. But that night, there was a light on at the end of the hallway. My heart started to beat faster as I got closer. I took out my flashlight and shined it where the light was, but I couldn't see anything. When I reached the door, I leaned in to look inside, and then I saw her, a woman. She was wearing a white dress. Her long hair covered her face, but she stood still. I gasped. "What are you doing here, ma'am?" I called out. The woman didn't answer. She just tilted her head slightly to the side. I took another step and tried to shine the flashlight on her face, but the light started to flicker. For a moment, everything went black. I swung my flashlight left and right, but she had disappeared. I went inside, checked around, but there was no one. The room was completely empty. I realized I couldn't stay there any longer, so I went back to the office. When I looked at the monitors, I saw that woman again. This time, she was standing in another hallway. She was looking right at me, right in the middle of the camera, but I couldn't make out her face exactly. There was a kind of blur, as if her face was moving. I immediately picked up the phone to call the nurses. There were only 3 nurses on night duty, and they were all in the emergency room. I picked up the phone and called one of them. "There's a woman walking around the hallways," I said. The nurse asked in a surprised voice, "Nobody came out. All the patients are in their places. Are you sure?" I couldn't answer, because just then the image on the camera changed again. The woman was no longer on the camera, but I could hear her. Yes, I could hear footsteps coming from the next room. I grabbed my flashlight and left the room. The footsteps led me to the section where the old operating rooms were. This place hadn't been used for a long time, and the lights didn't work most of the time. As I approached the end of the corridor, I felt a cold wind, but I couldn't figure out where the wind was coming from. All the windows were closed. For a moment I thought about going back, but it was as if some force was forcing me to stay there. When I reached the door, I looked inside, and that's when my heart almost stopped. The woman was there. But this time her face was clearly visible. Her face, it wasn't human. It was like a rotten, decayed piece of flesh. Her eyes were pitch black and bottomless. As I turned to retreat, I felt a hand touch my shoulder. I threw myself back, screaming, but no one was there. I had completely lost control now. I ran back to the office and turned on the lights, but there was nothing on the screens. The woman was gone. I didn't leave my security office until morning. I still couldn't figure out what had happened. I never saw that woman again. But every time I came in for a shift, I felt like she was still wandering those hallways. My name is Chris. Like any college student, I needed to find a part-time job to make some money. I ended up working the night shift at a warehouse. It was an easy job. I didn't do much. I checked the inventory, sorted the goods that arrived, and tidied up until the morning. I usually work alone, because I don't need anyone else for this job. But that night I realized I wasn't alone. Everything started off normally. I arrived at work at 10 o'clock at night, scanned my security badge, and walked through the big metal door. The warehouse was just an ordinary warehouse. Hundreds of shelves, thousands of boxes. Oh, couldn't tell how time passed when you worked there. I spent most of the night listening to music on headphones. But that night, I didn't want to listen to music. I had a strange uneasiness inside me. Around 11:30 at night, I passed by one of the shelves and heard something fall to the ground. This wasn't uncommon. There were times when the boxes weren't properly arranged, and this happened often. But this time, something was different. The sound was a little too loud. It had an eerie echo, as if a person had fallen to the ground, not just a box. I grabbed my flashlight and walked in the direction of the sound. My footsteps echoed as I made my way through the shelves. It was quiet, but the silence was nerve-wracking. When I finally reached where the sound was coming from, I saw several boxes scattered on the floor. The boxes were torn, their contents scattered everywhere. I muttered to myself, "Chris, it's probably a box that was misplaced. Don't scare yourself." Just as I was about to turn back and continue my work, I heard a rattling behind me. I turned my flashlight to the aisle just behind me, but I couldn't see anything, just the dark shadows of the shelves. "You're exaggerating," I muttered to myself, but then I heard another voice. This time it was a whisper. "Chris." I froze. The voice was clear, as if someone had said my name right behind me, but when I turned back, there was still no one there. My heart was pounding. I tried to find a logical explanation. The wind. Maybe it's an echo, I thought, but that didn't make much sense. There was no wind in the warehouse. As the hour passed, things started to get weirder. I went to the office to look at the security cameras. I was looking at the monitors. The cameras showed the corridors and the entrance door on all sides. Everything seemed normal. But after a while, I noticed movement. I saw a black shadow on the camera in the upper left corner. This shadow was moving slowly between the shelves. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but the shadow stopped. And after a while, it looked directly at the camera. At that moment, the shiver inside me turned into panic and fear. In spite of myself, I froze in front of the monitor. I decided to leave the office and go to where I had seen the shadow. Although I was scared, I thought that a thief had broken into the warehouse. I walked quietly. My flashlight was shaking, but it was because my hands were shaking. When I got between the shelves, it was dark and silent around me. Nothing was moving. Just as I decided to turn back, I saw a box fall to the ground. But this time I saw the box fall. It was as if an invisible hand had pushed it off the edge of the shelf. The sound of the box hitting the ground startled me. I shined my flashlight on the ground and walked toward it. But as I got closer to the ground, I noticed a strange stain on the box. It looked like blood. I took a step back. That's when I heard laughter. A thin, high-pitched laughter. It echoed through the shelves. It was hard to tell from which direction, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere. I ran back to the office. I locked the door and pulled out my phone. I considered calling the police, but what was I supposed to say? I see a shadow in the warehouse. It's calling me by name and laughing. That would be ridiculous. Instead, I decided to look at the security cameras again. As I looked at the monitors, I saw the shadow again. This time it was closer. It seemed to be moving toward me, moving from camera to camera. Finally, it appeared on the camera at the front of the office. But this time, it wasn't a shadow, but a clear figure. It was tall and thin. Its face wasn't clear because it was completely dark. But I could sense that it wasn't a person. The figure stopped right in front of the camera and brought its face closer to the screen. At that moment, the screen went black. All the cameras cut out at once. The office lights also went out. I was left in darkness. I tried to turn on my flashlight, but it didn't work. I turned on my phone's light, but it was also strangely distorted. At that moment, I heard a voice from behind the door. "Chris, open the door." My heart was pounding like it was going to jump out of my chest. I didn't go near the door. The sound repeated, louder this time. The doorknob slowly lowered. I relaxed a little when I remembered that the door was locked, but it didn't last long. The the door slowly began to swing. Before I knew it, the door opened with a loud bang. I expected someone to come in at any moment. I waited in fear for about 5 minutes. Finally, I mustered up the courage and looked outside. But there was no one outside. I got out of the warehouse and kept running until I found my car. As I started the engine, I saw a pair of bright eyes behind me. I quit my job that night. But it didn't end there. From that day on, whenever I was in a dark room, I felt those bright eyes watching me. And every night before I went to bed, I heard that voice whispering my name.